which is wonderful. So again, thank you so much for joining. Thanks to all of you who donated as well to help keep these types of programs going in the future. We will be doing about a 40 to 45-minute lecture. And then following that, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Now, everybody's microphones and cameras are turned off, but you can ask your questions at any time through the chat function of Zoom. And following the presentation, I will help to moderate and ask these questions to our speaker. One last thing before we do begin, we do want to recognize the Haudenosaunee people on whose ancestral home our museum is located here in Cooperstown, New York. We're very lucky to be in this village. There's such a wealth of history here. And also, there are two very important and influential American authors who hailed from this village. One, of course, being James Fenimore Cooper, but the other, his daughter, Susan Fenimore Cooper, who thankfully is sort of seeing a rediscovery these days. And one of the reasons for this rediscovery is because of our presenter tonight. Rochelle L. Johnson is professor and chair of environmental studies at the College of Idaho and the president of the Thoreau Society. A former president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, her writings on 19th century landscape aesthetics appear in a variety of journals and collections. She and her co-editor, Daniel Patterson, brought the only full edition of Susan Cooper's Rural Hours to readers through the University of Georgia Press. And we just happen to have it in our museum shop that you can come physically to the museum or go online and order it today. They also co-edited Cooper's other writings on landscape and nature. Rochelle's book, Passions for Nature, centers on Susan Fenimore Cooper, explaining her interest in landscape in terms of that of Susan Cooper's contemporaries, Emerson, Thoreau, Thomas Cole, and Andrew Jackson Downing. Rochelle's research has been supported by the Idaho Humanities Council, Yale University's Beinecke Library, the American Antiquarian Society, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She is also a published creative writer, currently completing a book about environmental grief and Susan Fenimore Cooper. You can find more about her at rochellejohnson.com, and you can also find more right now because here she is. Thank you so much, Rochelle. It's been so wonderful working with you over these past few years, and I cannot wait to hear what you're going to be talking about this evening.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's just great to be here. I'm going to share my screen before I go any further. Great. Okay. I think that's working. It's wonderful to be here tonight, and I want to thank Kevin Gray, but also all of the staff and administration there at the Fenimore Art Museum, doing such good cultural work in Cooperstown. I also want to thank some of my fellow scholars whose work and thinking and research has informed what I'll say tonight. My fellow Susan Fenimore Cooper scholars, the late Hugh McDougall and Rosalie Kurth, other scholars of the area, William Walker, Alan Taylor, Wayne Franklin, and my co-editor of much of Susan Fenimore Cooper's work, Daniel Patterson. And I especially want to thank John Cusick, whose work on Henry David Thoreau and Native Americans, Thoreau's interest in Native American cultures, has really enriched and informed my own. In some ways, all I'm going to do this evening is tell a story. It's a story that demonstrates the crucial role of museums and archives, of holdings in libraries, of curated documents, to knowing who we are and who we've been as a nation. It's a story of romantic mythologizing of Native Americans turning into something else. I want to start, though, by saying that I'm not Native American, and neither was Susan Fenimore Cooper. I'm a woman of Northern European descent. I grew up in a biracial family, and I now have a biracial family of my own. I currently reside in present-day Boise, Idaho, which is the traditional homelands of the Shoshone-Bannock peoples who remain a vital presence in this region. Susan Fenimore Cooper was also a woman of Northern European descent. She lived from 1813 to 1894, witnessing tremendous change in this nation during the course of the 19th century. She spent the last roughly 70 years of her life living in present-day Cooperstown, New York, on the traditional homelands of the Mohawk people and near the traditional homelands of the Oneida. Both groups help comprise the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy made up of some 6 original nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, as well as the Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. The Haudenosaunee are the people of the Longhouse. I want to tell the story of Susan Fenimore Cooper's complicated, growing grief. An invisible grief, until recently. I've been thinking a lot about grief and its frequent invisibility. I think about it in terms of climate change, environmental disruption, racial injustice. There's a lot of visible grief, but there's also much invisible grief. I hope to think about what that grief might mean to us. I advertised this talk with the permission and blessing of the Fenimore Museum with this Thomas Cole landscape painting. It's a landscape scene from Last of the Mohicans. It's a very layered representation of Native Americans. What I mean by that is that Cole is painting a scene from a James Fenimore Cooper novel. James Fenimore Cooper had concocted the scene in part to help represent the displacement of Native American peoples out of his region. Susan Fenimore Cooper grew up and knew so well as an adult this very storied, mythologized landscape. She knew this history of displacement, and she knew the history of a land that was enriched by story, much of it mythologized, much of it romanticized. She did her own first writing about Native Americans, as far as we know, in Rural Hours, which was published in 1850. While she was working on that book, she would frequent the forests and landscapes around the village. This is the village, circa 1885, closer to the end of her life. What she saw as she walked was this deep history of romantic mythology, and she wrote about it in Rural Hours. Here's some of what she says there. It was but yesterday that such beings peopled the forest. She's referring to Native Americans. Yesterday they were here. Today, scarce a vestige of their existence can be pointed out among us. She refers to Native Americans as a vanished race, even though she knew well that these people were not vanished at all, but had been displaced, many of them. She also referred to beings with as much life as runs within our own veins. And she says, it's easy to wish these people well, but surely something more may justly be required of us, of those who have taken their country and their place on earth. In these passages and others like them, we see that romanticization, that willingness to see a peoples who have vanished rather than been displaced, culturally decimated, with great violence performed against them. We also see, though, her conflicting interest in beings with as much life as runs within our own veins. It's this tension at the beginning of her career that I want to point to. And then there are very troubling passages in Rural Hours where Cooper's clearly adhering to a language and a cultural belief system that assumes the inferiority of Native American groups. In this passage, for instance, she writes, "It is painful indeed to remember how little has yet been done for the Indian during the 3 centuries since he and the white man first met on the Atlantic coast. But such is only the common course of things. A savage race is almost invariably corrupted rather than improved by its earliest contact with a civilized people. They suffer from the vices of civilization before they learn justly to comprehend its merits. It is with nations as with individuals. Amelioration is a slow process." There are so many assumptions in this quotation that we struggle profoundly with today. So many assumptions that are appalling, and so many assumptions that Susan Fenimore Cooper may not even know that she was holding. Just the phrase, a savage race, the white man versus this inferior civilization as she sees it, and the sort of assumed progress that Native Americans would make as this amelioration or healing occurred. All very troubling. This was typical for the language of rural hours. Susan Cooper couldn't help but know that Native Americans had been in her region because they still were. She writes of encounters with Mohawk and Oneida peoples there in the village and in the outskirts out of town. At one point, a group of people come to her door and take her to their old gathering land, or old camping land on Mill Island there in Cooperstown. She's very well aware that this is not a vanished race, but a group of peoples who have suffered, who have been forced out of an area. She also knew that Native Americans had been in her region because of so many stories of Native American bones that had been dug up as Cooperstown was settled, as fields were cleared. She knew the Native Americans weren't buried in the churchyards. They had been buried elsewhere, and their bones often relocated. As an adult, she witnessed this in a field very close to where she lived. We know that Cooper's interest in Native Americans continued because following the publication of Rural Hours, the publisher of Rural Hours, Putnam, G.P. Putnam, advertised both Rural Hours and a second book that Susan Cooper would soon come out with. That would actually be her third book. She had one before Rural Hours. Putnam advertises these two books together, and I'm going to show you this advertisement. On the top here is the advertisement for Rural Hours, this illustrated edition that many of you, I hope, have seen. The Fenimore has a gorgeous copy of it in special collections. Below that advertisement for a later edition of Rural Hours, you see an advertisement for The Shield, a narrative by Cooper, the author of Rural Hours. And you see there in the advertisement that The Shield is supposedly in press. The Shield was never published, but I want to tell you what we do know about it. This is an excerpt from a letter from James Fenimore Cooper to his publisher in Britain, Richard Bentley. And he points out here that although he has been managing the placement of her book, The Shield, in Richard Bentley's hands for European publication, Susan Fenimore Cooper is now taking over the negotiations because his health, as you see in the bold text here, unfits me for the task. Indeed, he would die just a few months later. Susan Fenimore Cooper writes herself to Richard Bentley and describes The Shield very briefly in this letter from 1851. It is called The Shield, a narrative, and relates to the habits and life of the red man before his intercourse with the whites, or rather to his condition at the period of the discovery. She's using the word intercourse in its old way that we don't tend to use it in today to mean interaction, or rather to his condition at the period of discovery. Here we begin to gain insight into Susan Fenimore Cooper's interest in the deeper history of the Native American people she so knew. A later letter to Richard Bentley says, "I've taken much pains to give the book accuracy in all its details. The first chapters will probably be printed in America within a month." But things stalled, and the project never did come to fruition. We see some of that here. She writes to her New York publisher, Putnam, "As regards to my own book, The Shield, I have not been very well and scarcely fit for composition. The delay in sending the first chapters, however, has proceeded from another cause. They contain various allusions to items of natural history, and fearful of making some mistake, I was anxious to confirm what had been written by examining one or two other books. Here we see that the shield will be based not just in her imaginings, but also in some deep research, and that she's claiming as one reason for the delay, her inability or difficulty getting adequate sources. And then there's this letter from November 1851 saying that she's going to send a few chapters, but it seems my lot to be always writing matters for which authorities are needed without having any at hand. She's aware of her ignorance. She's aware of her need to learn more in order to be accurate, and it's slowing her down. The shield never did hit the press. There are more letters surrounding its history. They're fascinating. They suggest that about 80 pages were stereotyped. They don't remain. But other writings about Native Americans remain in Susan Fenimore Cooper's hand, and we can learn something of her interest by looking at them. One of them actually uses the phrase, the shield, and suggests to me that maybe some of these pages may have been part of the shield. In some of these other manuscript pages, Cooper says things like, every successive wave of civilization rolling westward from the shores of Europe has moved the grand old forests which overshadowed their wigwams as it broke on the coast of the New World. Here we see her recognition that as European settlement moved across the continent, trees came down, forcing Native Americans from their homes, forcing dispossession. We also see passages like this one, which I've typed up here and shown you all the changes that she's made so you can see some of what she's up to as she's writing. Again, the troubling language. The movements of a savage tribe toward the light of civilization, however fitful and irregular, can never fail to claim a peculiar interest of their own if related with sincerity and fidelity. We whose ancestors were once in the same condition must always study the movement with a singular curiosity. Even a brief sketch, if correct in its outline and just in its proportions, may tell the strange story almost as clearly as elaborate volumes could do. The materials are necessarily few, but they are often apparently insignificant, but they touch at every point upon questions of the highest import. Their whole story, so far as it can ever be known, is closely blended with our own. I'm thrown here by her use of the phrase savage tribe, by her reference to the light of civilization in opposition to a supposed savage tribe. I'm interested by her analogy between her ancestors and Native American peoples, by her saying that their stories are closely blended, as if it's the story of humanity. Susan Fenimore Cooper continued her interest in Native Americans, and in 1885 and 1886, she published 16 related articles, a historical account called Missions to the Oneidas. Missions to the Oneidas was published in The Living Church, which is a weekly publication of the Episcopal Church. The articles total over 20,000 words. It's a substantial project. The main goal of Missions to the Oneidas is to describe the history of missions to the Oneida people, beginning with Catholic missionaries and then continuing through the Episcopal missions and to her present day, 1885 and 86, when the Oneida were largely in Wisconsin, having been dispossessed of their lands in New York. Here's some of what Susan Cooper says there. She refers to the sudden rush of civilization, to the white men at Green Bay when the Oneida had been forced to Wisconsin, whose object it was to debase the Indians by all the means in their power in order to render them odious to the whites and thus bring about their expulsion from the reservation. She refers to covetous Euro-American men, to the greed of speculators. 30 years have passed since Rural Hours was published, more than 30 years, when Susan Fenimore Cooper publishes Mission to the Oneidas. The language there is different. She's defensive of the Oneida people. She wants to uncover their story of dispossession and displacement. She's highlighting the ways in which Euro-American settlers have been horrible to them. In another section, she writes about the threat of extermination the Oneida were facing at one point in Wisconsin. And she says, this threat was in consequence of the terrible Indian massacres perpetrated in revenge for many abuses by the heathen tribes to the westward. Had there been no abuses on the part of our government and people, there would have been no massacres by the Indians. Those whose memories carry them back to that period can recall with shame this cry of extermination of a whole race, repeated by many newspapers and heard, alas, in some instances, under philanthropic roofs. Of course, the government never contemplated any measures so disgraceful to Christian civilization. It's this racialized violence that she is so angry about here. She's moralizing, and she's furious with a nation that is treating the Oneida as it has. We don't know, and I think we'll never know, all that Susan Fenimore Cooper wrote about Native Americans. This is a sentence that she wrote to her brother in 1855 when she was frustrated that she couldn't get more writing done. She said, "It's not improbable, I think, that when I'm lying in the church graveyard in Cooperstown, where she is, there will be found in my trunks and drawers as many manuscripts as Queen Bess left dresses in her wardrobe." Family lore has it that Susan Cooper was buried with many of her manuscripts and that she burned many, many more. But there are some things we have, and from them, we learn a lot. She wrote a letter on the 24th of January in 1885. This is just 9 years before she dies. She said in this letter, "From my earliest youth, I have been interested in the Indian race. My father always had in his library works connected with the red man, and these always had a great attraction for me. I remember reading the travels of Lewis and Clark when I was a mere child. As I grow older, the jouissance fades into less brilliant colors, but a feeling much stronger succeeds. Grief and shame at our national disgrace and lack of justice and wisdom in dealing with the wild race whose place we have taken. I have several times attempted to publish historical sketches of the people of the Longhouse, having taken great pains to make these sketches accurate by consulting the best authorities, but no publisher would print them. They were rejected without being read." We learn here that Susan Fenimore Cooper was aware of her changing understanding of Native American dispossession. She was aware of her romanticized mythology, the one she grew up with, the one she practiced. She was aware of grief and shame at national disgrace, lack of justice and wisdom. She still says they were a wild race, but she acknowledges that their place has been taken by her, by others. And of course, the Native Americans still thrive in many places. She then goes on in this letter, after saying that these manuscripts were rejected without being read. "No one cares to read a book about Indians," was the answer I received on a dozen different occasions. I've come to think of Susan Fenimore Cooper's relationship to Native American culture and history as an imperfect grief, a troubled compassion, a benevolent intention mixing with embedded racism. Her compassion is marred by her racism is confused by her compassion. Like me, perhaps like you, Susan Fenimore Cooper struggled imperfectly to understand her nation's history of racialized violence and attempted cultural obliteration. She tried to speak up on behalf of those things, and her attempts were rife with the same disease that plagued her nation's history. And she kept trying. I hope it goes without saying that all the grief in the world doesn't make a dent in the horrors. And it helps me and my students to recall that violence is not all this nation is made of. It is made of grief and shame over the injustices too, however marred. Ours is a legacy, an inheritance of long violence and startling blindness. Ours is a legacy, an inheritance of slow grief and long shame over these same things. Thank you for listening. Kevin, I'd love to take questions or comments if we have time.
We certainly do have time.
I am so glad I
I
tried to make it a little shorter so we'd have more time for
No, that was
conversation.
amazing. I feel like I need to take a moment after that. That and I was unaware of her statements on Native Americans following the publishing of Rural Hours. So that was really illuminating. Clearly, a lot had happened in the country during those 30 some odd
Right.
years as well. So I'm curious what what she had seen, what she had experienced to kind of bring that understanding to that level at that point. But
Yeah, well, and that's you raise a really good point. I mean, there are other people, in particular, other European American women who are writing on behalf of Native Americans. Some novels that are written earlier in the 19th century that are really trying to humanize Native American characters for readers, are trying to show sympathy. They're similarly mired in troubling discourse and in problematic assumptions. But they're trying. That's all we can say. And then, of course, by the time Susan Fenimore Cooper is writing her later writings there, uh, she knows well the Cherokee Trail of Tears from the late 1830s. She knows well the legacies of displacement and continued violence. And in the 1880s in particular, a number of organizations and groups were forming around the country, mostly by women, but not entirely, to raise awareness of Native American dispossession specifically, and to try to influence the government to be more humane to Native American groups all around the country. And some of that failed miserably with the Dawes Act, but it's yeah, that's so yeah. She's certainly not the only one, and she's certainly not the most successful one. But I think it's an important story for us to know.
I do want to remind everybody that if you do have questions, please, now is the time to type them into the chat. Richard asks, and I think this kind of leads into what we were just talking about, were her literary contemporaries who also wrote about Native Americans aware of her writings?
It's a great question. Certainly, some of them were. Lydia Maria Child, who wrote a novel called Hobomok in 1824, very likely would have been aware of Susan Fenimore Cooper because Susan Fenimore Cooper was publishing in the same literary magazines as Lydia Maria Child. Catherine Mariah Sedgwick, who had written Hope Leslie in 1827, which was sort of a response to James Fenimore Cooper's novels. Um, she may have known of Susan Fenimore Cooper, but probably just through her being the daughter of James Fenimore Cooper. A lot of people knew about her because of that. I mean, by the time Susan Cooper writes Mission to the Oneidas, it's so much later, and that is published in the Episcopal Church magazine, not in Harper's or some of the other really major magazines that she published in. And some of her short stories were published in more popular magazines. But that's a great question. I will say that there are a surprising number to me of letters to Susan Fenimore Cooper from people in her region who are inquiring about Native American habits, Native American history, Native American customs. I think partly she may have been kind of suspected to know a fair amount about those topics just by virtue of being the daughter of her father. Although there are also indications that she was seen as somewhat of an authority on these subjects. So it's really fascinating, and there's so much that we don't know.
Michael asks, and I'm going to actually change up the question a tiny bit. Can you summarize any personal relationships or experiences that Susan had with Native Americans that she either references in Rural Hours or other knowledge that you might have?
Sure. In Rural Hours, the most memorable account is the one that I mentioned very briefly, where a small group of women come to the front door there when she's living in Otsego Hall in Cooperstown, and they're selling baskets, and they offer to take her to Mill Island, and she makes that trip with them. She doesn't write extensively about other interactions with Native Americans, but she does talk about seeing Native Americans when she's passing through other areas of the state. So that's all that's coming to mind right now.
Okay. Um, Speaking of the shield, which, oh God, I wish she had managed to complete that. It sounds amazing. Is there any indication of why she used that particular title?
No,
Hmm.
um, I've done a lot of thinking and research about that, and at one point I thought it might be a reference to Christianity, to the shield of Christianity. That's a phrase that's used in the Bible, and Susan Fenimore Cooper was quite religious and quite the Episcopalian. So I thought that, but then in the manuscript pages I was showing you, it's used to refer to a character. So there's a character named the Shield, or nicknamed the Shield. So I don't know the answer to that question. And of course it could be both. It could be that the character of the Shield is somehow evocative of a Christianity, but the manuscript pages that we have are incomplete and out of order, and it's very difficult to determine the exact story they were meant to tell, and they're only partial. So.
Hmm. Speaking of Episcopalianism, Emily would like to know if what was the position of the Episcopal Church, the general position at the time of the dispossession of indigenous nations.
Well, I can't speak to their position on the dispossession of all indigenous nations, but I can speak to, because I know best, their interest in the Oneida people. And truly, Missions to the Oneidas is a very interesting history to read if you're fascinated by the Anglican Episcopalian interest in the Oneida people. So they had a mission and worked closely with the Oneida for centuries, and very intensely in the 19th century. And Susan Fenimore Cooper was relying on especially one diary of the wife of one of the missionaries there in Wisconsin. As she was writing her work, she was corresponding with a lot of people to get her background materials right for that Missions to the Oneidas. But the Episcopal Church was tried to be very supportive of the Oneida people. I say tried to be because that support is always compromised by assumptions about the superiority of Christianity and of the English language. There are materials from the 19th century about frustration that the children are resisting learning English and they're still clinging to their old language. And we now know how terribly culturally violent that sort of robbing of language is. That was not something they knew in the 19th century. So it's a very long and very complicated history, and I certainly can't speak to it across the many hundreds of indigenous groups.
Sure. Jesse would like to know, did Susan correspond with Lewis Henry Morgan, who wrote about Senecas and other native people?
She may well have. I would have to check my massive spreadsheet of thousands of Susan Pember Cooper letters to check. Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't know off the top of my head, but she may well have. Jesse can email me and we'll look it up.
Lindsay is curious about the receptivity of male authors of the time who wrote about Native Americans. Were there many, and were publishers willing to support their writings despite the stated perspective that no one wants to read about Indians?
Well, it's just true that in the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, the 19th century writings about Native Americans that were popular were James Fenimore Cooper's novels. Unfortunately, because of uh, publishers' agreements that he made during his lifetime and misunderstandings, oversights, Susan Fenimore Cooper didn't benefit financially much at all from those sales, but unfortunately, the view that was popular, that was sought, was that sort of storied mythologizing that, in the end, for all of James Fenimore Cooper's attentiveness to some aspects of Native American culture, in the end, that is a story or a sequence of stories that justifies and it sort of explains away, shies away from the implications and realities and extraordinary ongoing cultural violence done to so many Native American peoples.
Mhm.
Those are the books that were popular. But by the end of the century, someone like Helen Hunt Jackson is writing. So Helen Hunt Jackson, by the end of the 19th century, she becomes very engaged in fighting against Native American land dispossession. And she's the author of the book Ramona, which is a fictional narrative that takes this topic directly on. And Ramona sold very, very well. That's a very late text. Let's see, 1884. Yeah. And she had also published A Century of Dishonor in 1881. That's Helen Hunt Jackson. And that's a history of dishonest land treaties between the government and Native Americans. So again, by the end of the century, the discourse is shifting, becoming much more compassionate in what we would consider realistic in acknowledging what was happening. And trying to speak up on behalf of Native groups.
Right. Before I get to Abby's question, that leads me to think about James Fenimore Cooper. Is there any indication that did Susan ever write about what her kind of thoughts were, especially later in her life, about her father's writings, especially in regards to the way he depicted Native Americans in these early novels that had such a influence on the way white settlers and Europeans thought about the Native people. Did she ever mention kind of her thoughts on her father's work?
Yes, that's a great question. It's so rich, Kevin. That's why I respond that way. Um, we know that part of why Susan Fenimore Cooper's career as an author was not as prolific as it otherwise would have been was because she was managing her father's literary legacy, especially after his death. Before his death, she was assisting him, and then after his death, she was with the help of some family, but she was largely managing his literary legacy. And that involved trying to make money, trying to get contracts right, but it also involved trying to right his reputation, because he had earned a reputation as a really pernicious personality. So while he was loved for his literature, he was also quite condemned for various dealings. In any case, she undertook a series of introductions to his works that were substantial introductions. And this is where I'm going to answer your question. In these introductions to his novels, she would tell the stories behind his writing of the novels. So they're somewhat autobiographical, somewhat biographical. They are also autobiographical. Sometimes they're about her. But they're about what was happening in his life or the life of the family or the life of the nation at the time that he was working on his various novels. And she published these in a volume called Pages and Pictures. It's a beautiful volume, but she is absolutely celebrating the work of her father. She doesn't take on the question of justice or injustice or race. Those weren't those weren't terms for her in the way that they are now for us. But she knows every word of his writing, and they had a very, very loving and supportive relationship. I mean, you get the sense of that when he's trying to negotiate on her behalf with Richard Bentley for The Shield. He had done that for Rural Hours. He had worked with Putnam on Rural Hours. On the morning that Rural Hours was published, he hung a beautiful placard, an advertising placard on her bedroom door to celebrate that her book was out. So they had a very loving relationship. I don't think she never would have attacked her father. It just wasn't in her 19th century moral code or code of behavior. But clearly, by the end of her life, we see in that letter that references his collection in Lewis and Clark, she's not seeing things the way she once did.
Yeah, and that's kind of what made me think of that question, that there were any other things later in life that she had said or written. So interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Very interesting. So Abby asks, Art, and I think you answered this during your talk a little bit. Are there any pages of the Shield available today?
There are not.
Hmm.
No, there are not. Uh, yeah, no, there aren't.
She
I
says
wish
she
there
heard
were.
she heard that there was a trunk found with filled with writings. I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I was showing you manuscript pages from the Yale Beinecke Library that may or may not be pages of the Shield. We don't know. They may be pages of other writings. So yeah, they have some loose manuscript pages there, but we don't know if they're the Shield.
Gotcha. Michael says earlier you mentioned cultural violence against Native Americans. Was Susan an advocate of or a witness to Native American boarding schools forced upon them to indoctrinate them to a Christianity?
She certainly knew of them, and I have no indication that she thought they were a bad idea. Um, she writes about orphanages in her region who housed Native American children, and she does so in a supportive way. She herself ran an orphanage, and so she's hooked in with the orphanage director community in her region, and especially sort of Christian motivated orphanages. And she indicates no problem with any of that. And similarly, in Missions to the Oneidas, when she's discussing the role of boarding schools and mission schools for Native American children, she doesn't indicate that she was opposed to such a thing. I I just don't think it was in her wheelhouse, given her background, her education, her time, um, and her position in society. It unfortunately was not in her wheelhouse to see those forms of cultural violence. The boarding school movement also grows quite a bit towards the end of the 19th century and then into the early 20th, of course. So this would have been an early phenomenon for her.
Sandy states Cooper's romantic uh, racializing sounds very similar to Thoreau's to their ears. Do you find this an apt comparison in your knowledge of both writers, or are there important differences?
Thanks for that question. Um, I I can speak to that. I will say that John Cusick, who I mentioned at the beginning, is really the expert on the topic of Thoreau's writings about Native Americans. Um, but I've heard John speak a lot, and of course I've read a lot of Thoreau. So I'll dive in and do the best I can with this question. Um, Henry David Thoreau studied the Penobscot primarily of Maine, and his studies differ because he was interested in their language, in their relationship to place, and he was able to actually spend time with Penobscot people in Maine. He made 3 trips to Maine, was it 4? And wrote about them in his now book, The Maine Woods, published as a series of essays. His studies there are interested in learning customs, culture, language. In other writings, books that we call the Indian notebooks, which were just manuscript notebooks that Thoreau kept, but significant, sizable, and ongoing, Thoreau recorded a lot of deep history about Native Americans, largely from the sources written by explorers and settlers, but he took copious notes on early discoverer and settlement history about Native Americans, writing, copying down information, language information, historical information, information about what different groups ate and where they lived and how they moved. So his interest is encyclopedic in some ways, and also absolutely romanticized, yes, and imperfect. As John Cusick has pointed out, Henry David Thoreau somehow was interested in going to Maine to be with the Penobscot, but never visited the Mashpee he was near when he was on Cape Cod, or the Neshoba, who were much closer to him there in Concord, Massachusetts. So had he been bent on learning everything he could about Native American groups, he had indigenous communities very close to him, with whom he could have spent time and learned. So yeah, it was kind of a scholarly look, and yeah, certainly romanticized. It's very difficult to find European American writers in the 19th century who aren't writing about Native Americans without a really troubling romantic view.
Mhm. There's some photographers in that time period as well with the same issue.
Yeah, Catlin. Yeah, sure.
So I'm
Doing
going to make
painting.
one last call for any questions. This is your last call to type them in the chat. And while we're waiting for any final questions, I just want to mention to everybody that we were able to record this. Thank you to Rochelle for allowing us to do that. So we'll be able to post this to our YouTube channel probably sometime next week. I will email everybody who registered for this talk once that happens so that you can go to the link and watch it again or share it with friends. And Rochelle, I wanted to ask you if you can talk about it briefly. In your bio, there is the talk of a book, Passions for Nature, about Susan Fenimore Cooper. Could you talk a little bit about that particular book?
Absolutely. Yes, I would be happy to talk about that. Passions for Nature is a scholarly book that places Susan Fenimore Cooper at its center. So that was my first book-length study of Susan Fenimore Cooper. And what I do in that book is focus especially on her landscape aesthetics, her environmental understanding, her sense of the human place in the natural world. And I focus largely on rural hours in those discussions, but not entirely. Susan Fenimore Cooper also has many other essays about nature and landscape, and my co-editor Daniel Patterson and I actually collected many of those in a little volume called Susan Fenimore Cooper, Essays on Nature and Landscape. Those are available from University of Georgia Press. But what I do in that book is talk about Susan Fenimore Cooper's corpus as it relates to landscape and landscape aesthetics in relation to some of the other very well remembered figures of her time who were also interested in landscape aesthetics. So there's a chapter that examines Emerson, one on Thoreau, one on Andrew Jackson Downing, and always looking, and one on Thomas Cole, the landscape painter, always looking at their work in relation to Susan Fenimore Cooper's. It's a book that is trying to help us see what she was doing that was unique, what she was doing that was similar to some of her contemporaries in terms of building a national landscape aesthetics. So that's Passions for Nature, which is a University of Georgia Press title. It has a long, complicated academic subtitle called something like 19th Century America's Aesthetics of Alienation, because that's what you have to do
I
as
have
an
to do that.
academic. Yeah, you have to
Exactly.
do that. Now, now I'm writing a book that will focus in part on Susan Fenimore Cooper. You mentioned it in your introduction. It's a book about Susan Fenimore Cooper and environmental grief, and that is I'm writing for all audiences, and in hopes of sharing her story, including some of what I shared tonight, more broadly with the general public.
Well, we cannot wait for that to be released, and hopefully you'll be willing to come back and talk about it at that
I'd
time.
love that. I'd love
Um,
that. Thank you.
or pretty much anything you want to talk about, Rochelle. We love having you. It's always such an interesting discussion, and no matter what angle you take this from, when we talk about Susan or Hudson River School, it's always so very, very interesting. So
No, thank you,
again,
Kevin.
I
I'm
cannot
delighted
thank
to be here.
yeah, I cannot thank you enough, Rochelle. And our audience is saying the same thing right now in the chat. So I want to thank all of our visitors, all of our registrants for joining us tonight. Rochelle, I want to thank you one last time. Are there any final words you'd like to leave us with, or you want to mention your website again, anything like that?
Oh, RochelleLJohnson.com. But really, I want to thank you all for coming. It's such an honor to get to present to this group. I'm sitting here for the first time scrolling the names of everyone who's here, and it's just lovely to see such a gathering of people from across this whole country, which is the benefit and beauty of Zoom. Kevin, I really want to thank you for having me again. It's always a delight to lecture for the Fenmore and to just explore as I prepare these lectures the rich connections that emerge when we look at material culture and the holdings of museums and documents and turn them into stories that we find meaning in. So thank you so much, Kevin, for having me.
And the door is always open for more. So thank you. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.